Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the demo for Dying Light. Yes, you heard that right. It has a demo. That just kind of blew my mind in and of itself. But it was a good opportunity for me to take a look at the game because I frankly had no interest in it to begin with. But since I have been asked about it before, I figured I should check the demo out at least and see if I can formulate at least an opinion on what the demo's like and whether or not I'm going to be reviewing the game later on. The game is by Techland and published by Warner Brothers. It was originally released in January of this year, and the demo came out in August. It's about an hour worth of gameplay, so it basically lets you run around and do a single mission and do various side activities like rescuing survivors or activating safe houses and that kind of thing. But generally speaking, there's really not all that much actual content to the demo, so you're going to have to keep that in mind when we get later on into the gameplay segment. As far as presentation goes, I do have this thing maxed out, and it mostly runs fine. I have had some pretty significant frame drops before, but it's not anything that really was unplayable by any stretch of the imagination. And it looks alright. It doesn't look amazing, but that's mostly because they went for the brown and gray and realistic style. So what ends up happening with that is that most of the environments in this are brown. Lots of brown. Now they do throw in a few colors here and there to actually make things pop out a bit more, but they are a bit washed out for the most part, so while it does work okay for breaking up the monotony of just brown, 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 it ultimately is not enough to really save the visuals from being really unappealing. Even though the graphics quality is fine. In fact, for the most part, the graphics quality is pretty good. They have some pretty solid modeling and texture work. They have mostly pretty decent animations. I mean, there wasn't anything that was glaringly awful. Certainly not like in, say, Dead Island, where all of the animations were downright terrible. So there was that. But it ultimately just ended up not being a particularly appealing graphic style just because of the color scheme. I really don't understand why Techland is so obsessed with just making everything brown or gray, but they keep doing it and it keeps looking worse and worse. Luckily, we had some breakups in the monotony with things like Call of Juarez Gunslinger, but compared to the previous game, that was a godsend, and compared to this, it's still a godsend. Anyway, sound design is one thing they did considerably better in this than they did in Dead Island. The voice acting is mostly pretty solid. It's not exactly the best voice acting around, but it's certainly nothing that's glaringly awful like a lot of it was in Dead Island. The sound effects mostly work alright. Nothing was particularly great, but there wasn't anything that was really underpowered or anything like that. When I was smacking zombies around with a baseball bat, for example, specifically it was a metal baseball bat. It sounded like you were hitting things with a metal baseball bat, so there was that. But there wasn't anything that really felt truly visceral and awesome when I was swinging these melee weapons around, or even when I was shooting the pistol at things. So they could have worked on that a bit more, I think, but at least it's passable. It works just fine. And as far as the music goes, it's really not all that noticeable, partly because it's really soft and somber for the most part, and it has this kind of African styling to it in a lot of spots. I think that what they're going for is a sort of fictionalized South African setting, and so there is a bit of African influence in the music, and it works okay, but I barely notice it, if ever. Mostly because it's pretty quiet, and you're not really concerned about the music when you're running around smacking zombies in the face over and over and over again. Speaking of smacking zombies in the face over and over again, as decent as the presentation is, the gameplay is really problematic. And it's problematic because I can sum it up like this. Dying Light is Dead Island with parkour. And that's really it. The demo starts you off with a variety of weapons, including a pistol with pretty limited ammo, so you probably want to save that for the beefier enemies. But you do get a variety of melee weapons, including a metal baseball bat, as well as a sort of bush knife, I guess is the best way to describe it. And you run around eviscerating zombies, running on rooftops, jumping on things, and completing various side objectives as far as the demo goes. There is no real story to it, so I didn't really notice any spoilers or anything like that. In fact, I didn't really bother with the actual mission because it was just boring as hell when I actually tried to do it. So it basically ends up being a more open world style Dead Island game. which should raise some red flags for you if you played Dead Island and you are along the same lines that I was when it came to that game. If you need to be brought up to speed on that, I hated Dead Island. It was an incredibly boring game where you literally did nothing but run around whacking zombies in the face with an incredibly underwhelming melee system where it was reliant on stats and not how decent you were in melee or even what you were using in as far as the melee weapons goes. It was basically if you took Borderlands and smashed it together with a zombie sort of survival game and didn't wipe away the bloody mess, and it was just awful in really every regard. Dying Light uses that as a base, so already you're going to see some pretty significant problems. First problem, the melee system is pretty much exactly the same as Dead Island's, which means that you're going to be hammering the left mouse button as you just repeatedly smack zombies over and over and over again until they finally collapse into a heap, and that's really it. That's the entire melee system in a nutshell, although they do have a power attack available where you can hold the melee button down, which is left mouse button, and you can then release it to do a powerful swing that will probably knock them over. That's kind of the extent of the melee system. Where they did change things up a bit is in the movement system related to the actual combat, because now you can have a drop kick if you unlock it, and the drop kick is mildly amusing for the first couple of times you do it, and then you realize how completely pointless it is. And unlike in Dead Island, the basic kick is no longer the win button, basically. So you have to be a lot more reliant on the actual weapons this time around, and it just gets incredibly tedious. The weapons do degrade over time, at least the melee weapons do, so you will have to repair those by pressing the reload button after a while when you see their durability meter going down. And it is kind of amusing because it will actually reflect on the weapon model that you've repaired it, that you might have taped something to it, or you bolted a few bits of rebar into something or something like that to reinforce it. And unlike in Dead Island, where the absolutely ridiculous weaponry that you could put together and repair and things like that was really at odds with the actual style of the game, this one doesn't take itself as seriously, so it fits in slightly better, but even then, it's still not really all that reflective of the full game experience, because it very clearly takes itself seriously up to a point, and then on the side stuff is where it just kind of lets loose a bit. It doesn't let loose enough. It's not to the same kind of degree as, say, Dead Rising, which is completely and utterly absurd and just rolls with it. And that's the reason that game is even remotely amusing, is because it just doesn't take itself remotely seriously. And when you get to something like this, which does take itself fairly seriously and is still a pretty ridiculous game, it's at odds. And luckily they don't really throw a lot of story stuff into this, so you don't really get much of the clash between the ridiculousness of the gameplay and the seriousness of the plot, but it's still something that's worth noting. But as far as the other elements of gameplay goes, the actual shooting mechanics when you're using the pistol are incredibly standard and really not all that satisfying. And of course, guns do bring pretty much every zombie down on you immediately, so that is worth noting. It's not really a big problem considering how incredibly weak most of the zombies are to fight in this thing, but if you were doing that at night, for example, you would have the bigger, nastier stuff coming down on you all at once, and that would not be good. That does bring up the day-night mechanic, but unfortunately I really couldn't test that in this because the way that the demo ends in terms of its time limit, you don't really have enough time to really accurately assess how the nighttime plays into it. Supposedly during the night, zombies are a lot tougher, and there's a lot more of the really special zombies out there that have particularly powerful abilities that you have to deal with. And not only that, but you basically can't see what you're doing, so it becomes problematic when you are stuck out at night and you don't get to go to a safe area. But again, they don't really give you enough time to really assess that when it comes to the demo, because it only becomes night in the last 5 to 15 minutes of the demo's timer, so it really isn't an accurate depiction of the day-night cycle, unfortunately. And that's one of only 2 additions to the Dead Island formula, the other one being parkour. Which of course means that you can run around and jump up to climb up buildings and run across rooftops and run along walls and things like that. But it's pretty simplistic, and while it does work, it's not particularly impressive, and it really just comes across as a gimmick more than anything else. Although it is decently implemented, so I do have to give them that. Apart from those 2 additions, you have refinements on the Dead Island formula, like I said with combat already. But you also have refinements to the skill system, you have refinements to the crafting system, which is pretty much identical. And it's just a slightly more polished Dead Island experience. So if you're one of those people who completely baffles me by actually liking Dead Island, you'll probably like Dying Light as well. But when it comes to how I feel about this thing and how people who would probably think like me on this particular matter would feel about it, this is basically just a confirmation of, oh, it's just Dead Island with parkour, and that's pretty much it. And that's really all we needed to know to come to a full conclusion on this. I mean, if you want to check this thing out, you can still take a look at the demo, no problem, because it's freely available on Steam, and I'll have a link in the description box to the Steam page, so you can pick up the demo for yourself if you want. But, like I said, it's pretty much just confirmation of what I expected already, which was Dead Island with parkour. And that's exactly what this is. It's a slightly refined Dead Island where you can run along rooftops as a gimmick. And that's pretty much it. And that comes with the problems that Dead Island had, which is especially that it's incredibly boring. You just run around and you smack zombies around for a bit, and that's pretty much it. You do have those side activities you can do, but they're basically just go over here and press the use key, and now you have succeeded. Or save these survivors by cutting down these bad guys. Okay, not that big of a deal. Basically just a bunch of open world filler content. It's boring, it's just another frickin' zombie game in a sea of frickin' zombie games, where the only thing that really differentiates it from others is that you can run along rooftops. I am not at all impressed by it. And as of this demo, I'm not even going to bother picking up the full game. I see no reason to, considering I already reviewed Dead Island and hated it, and if I were to try to review this, I would hate it just as much. Just because it's the same damn thing all over again, just with parkour. Whoop-de-doodle-doo. Your mileage, of course, may vary on that. If you're one of those people who absolutely loves mind-bogglingly tedious games, then you might be able to get something out of it. Or if you're just a die-hard zombie game fan for whatever bizarre reason, then you might be able to get something out of it. But even if you are looking into this thing and going, oh, well, this looks up my alley, I still recommend checking out the demo, just to be sure. Thanks for watching.